All right, good evening, folks. Thank you all very much for coming out this afternoon. I also heard that this is our first paid event. However, you got free pizza, therefore I don't feel a whole ton of pressure, that I need to deliver that much more above and beyond, but I will try. Today's topic is the newly released and announced AI action plan coming out of the US last Wednesday, actually. And I mean, you can kind of get a tone of what they're thinking. The subtext there is winning the race. What race? Well, we'll get into that conversation. But given how nascent it is, given how nascent the ask was of me, I also thought that it'd be helpful if we go through this together. But I will just ask very quickly: has anybody here, aside from Jason, read the USAA action plan? One person. So I was going to steal your line and say that I know one more thing than the other people in here, but I can't because you read it. So you'll keep me honest then, as will you, Jason, about some of the things that we tease out of this. I thought we could just walk through it together. And then there's some themes that maybe we could discuss, but of course, at a certain point, we'll just open it up to general discussion. All right, so diving into it. They kind of call it out right in the first sentence there. America's in a race for global dominance in AI. I mean, among many other things, clearly, and that's generally been the tone coming out of this administration. If I remember correctly, there was like a request put out to the industry a few months before this asking for action plans on AI. I think there was even like a memo coming out of Anthropic around approaches for an AI action plan for the US. But all that to say, the administration came up with their own, and we're going to dive into what that really looks like. I mean, they say it's their roadmap to win the race, and again, which race and for whom? Those are probably questions we should ask of ourselves. But there's definitely some value in, I think, what was presented in this plan. It is somewhat comprehensive, very, I think, can be problematic depending on how you're looking at it. But anyways, we'll let you be the judge of that too. If it works. There we go. Not quite. There we go. All right. So it's almost 30 pages, but it's centered around three main pillars, and it's pretty, intuitive if you want to think about them, which is accelerating innovation, kind of like they're doing what they're doing, but also build the infrastructure to support that. And I'm sure most of you in this room are no stranger to kind of the constraints that all major jurisdictions that have meaningful AI development programs are struggling with, particularly around their energy supply, much less thinking about sustainable energy to support that. It's quite extensive. There's 103 policy actions in this document, and that's not including the 3 executive orders that kind of came out alongside it, which kind of adds a little bit more specificity, but also concern around what those actions really mean. And it's inclusive of a whole, broad list of agencies and entities at the federal level, which again, can kind of each be pulled on as its own thread about what does that really mean for that institution and what direction is that going. If I'd call out just one right up at the front, you'll see about 4 down from the top in that list, there's one called the Center for AI Standards and Innovation. This may be very familiar for you, but it was news to me that that used to be the US AI Safety Institute. And while so many other jurisdictions are establishing or trying to spin up, the capabilities in their own, they have gone and renamed theirs and have effectively, I think, changed part of the modus operandi behind it. So anyways, to digress, let's get into the plan. But by the way, stop me anytime for questions, comments, maybe not concerns because there's a lot of them. And I will learn how to use a clicker eventually. All right, first pillar, right? So they must have the most powerful AI systems in the world. No surprise. But I mean, hey, I underline the fact that they want to create conditions where private sector led innovation can flourish. And again, we'll just call it out right at the bat that, like, hey, why only private sector led? And we can talk more about that in a bit. And right off the bat, the very first objective of this plan is to remove, as they call it, red tape and onerous regulation. I wasn't aware that we had a very effective regulatory regime yet, but apparently it's already onerous. And so they have many in action throughout the entire plan. You'll see where they need to get rid of, as they will call it, a hindrance. They will call it onerous. They will call it burdensome. But clearly, no particular ideological bent there. And one thing I'll just call it up front, and I'll step off of the whole political lens in a second, which is a lot of the language is tied to one, it's just adversarial in some respects, but also seems to have an overwhelming focus, which again is not specific to the plan on what the previous administration did, and just basically countering that, some of the dangerous actions that they took. Um, but hey, I mean, some of these things read as quite reasonable. So you can kind of see in that first objective there. Each objective, by the way, has its own recommended policy actions, as you can see. One of them being, identify, revise, or repeal regulations that hinder AI development or deployment. Seems sensible, but again, what does that actually mean in practice? 1.2, we don't have to go very far to see something that again really raises some serious questions about ensuring that frontier AI, like AI at the cutting edge, is protecting free speech and American values. I don't even know that we know what the latter of those two things are, and I don't think they do either because it's very much in contention right now. And so again, kind of raises concerns when you see right off the bat. At one point the NIST, National Institute for Standards and Technology, keep me honest, please, had kind of almost like first meaningful playbook that came out to the industry about how to approach risk and managing the risks of AI, what framework you could use, almost like a universal framework that could be used by organizations of any size, at least as a starting point. And the only kind of amendment called for right at the front is to eliminate references to misinformation, fair enough, but DEI and climate change. Not 100% sure why that was the main focus. I mean, I think we do know why, but again, this is where the plan itself, and we'll keep going through it, which is it seems reasonable, in some of its objectives, but then when you actually get into the policy actions to support that, I think you end up left with a lot of questions because it says, okay, we need to conduct research on frontier models from China, sorry, for alignment with CCP talking points and censorship. I mean, I don't know why that's specific to them, because one would imagine they might be doing something similar, and I'll show you why in a second, because there is very clearly a tone of ideological kind of almost like policing throughout this and some of the executive orders that support it. One piece of this that I think is effectively good for the ecosystem, though, is the focus on open source and open weight AI. They do very clearly acknowledge how much that is a benefit to the global industry, but to growing the domestic sector at home. That the open and free sharing of new discoveries across sectors, be that academia, private, public, is just generally positive. And then there is a kind of geostrategic angle to it as well, which is by being open source, you also encourage adoption of US style models, which of course increases influence as well. And by the way, just to make sure, can you repeat some of those recommended policy actions? I know it shows it kind of small here. I thought it'd be a little bigger, but yeah. Cool. All right. Won't spend a whole ton of time on 1.4 just because I mean it's pretty straightforward, enable AI adoption. But I think one good call out there is regulatory sandboxes. So again, kind of one of those things that's just generally objectively good. You want to give firms, both big and small, the leeway to try new things, almost like a safe harbor, to try new ideas, go fast, break things, but of course in a controlled environment. And this is something that's been tried and tested for other types of technology, even in kind of my previous life, which is in the banking sector. Even our regulators would offer regulatory sandboxes to try out new technologies. 1.5, and sorry, I'm kind of just rhyming off the numbers, but 1.5 is more about the labor force, and so I think just generally speaking, it was a pretty heartening thing to see how much they considered actually the impact of labor force. I didn't see too much like kind of dogma or rhetoric coming through there. It was more so just very pragmatic, thinking about where's funding going to come from, where do you need to develop skills, that you need a closer relationship between industry and the academic sector as well. And honestly, even being as going as deep as saying, hey, we need to reach kids in middle school and high school and get them thinking about these careers early, which I think just generally speaking is a good thing. STEM education certainly could use a boost in this region. And so to that end, and this is why I say there are mixed in here things that are just, I think, objectively good, um, including supporting manufacturing, which is a major challenge right now, especially as global supply chains are increasingly at risk of being disrupted again, whether by geopolitical tensions or climate disasters, and just also the dire need for every region that's trying to develop to get a hold of chips. And so The US clearly has recognized their vulnerability in that regard. You would all know this from the CHIPS Act from a couple of years ago. This is kind of just supporting that, and then also recognizing the fact that hey, like it's beyond just manufacturing the actual chip; it's manufacturing the supply chain that leads up to building that chip, including actually manufacturing the manufacturing line. So like they do get into that kind of detail. Um, Enabling science, which I think is probably a given. Building world-class scientific data sets, which I think is is again in line kind of with the open source, is something that is heartening to see in a way. There's not much of a kind of rhetoric-driven approach to it can only be certain kinds of ideologies or it needs to be bias-free. It's really just about hey, like we need to have standards for how data is used, the kind of data that's being put out there, that you need access to secure compute environments. However, there is a third bullet there that I mean, sounds logical. I honestly don't know enough about it for, to make any comment on it, but just I found it interesting that just kind of threw it in there that they're going to explore a whole genome sequencing program for life on all federal lands. And ostensibly that's to improve the functioning of models being used in the biological domain, but then someone knows more about that, just kind of threw me for a little bit of a loop there because that seemed really, really specific. And there's one more here when we get to the end that will probably throw you guys for a loop. Um, Advancing the science of AI, so I won't spend much time there. I think we kind of know about what that means. But investing in interpretability, control, robustness, I mean, again, just something that's objectively good, something that it's not, doesn't have much of a political tone to it. The only thing that kind of raises a question is that it's supposed to be led by their KZ and the National Science Foundation. At least for the KZ, we know that that's run out of the Department of Commerce. And so, what control and interoperability means may be influenced by that, but just generally speaking, probably a positive thing. And do talk about kind of industry best practices like creating a hackathon to solicit the best and the brightest across the country. Building an evaluations ecosystem, which is badly needed, is definitely a priority here. What kind of evaluations, who does them, under what framework, under what guidelines? I think those are the questions we probably want to ask. But again, pretty uncontroversial, I would think, statement and objective. Okay, and accelerating adoption in government. I mean, I think just generally speaking, this is something that we've seen across the board in developed nations. One, to build trust. Two, to improve the delivery and efficiency of services. In terms of procurement, though, and it's worth noting, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. In part of the executive order on eliminating woke AI, there are procurement rules, and part of that principle, though, is that they can't those tools or LLMs can't be subject to any kind of ideological. They must be bias free and not be subject to any kind of ideological dogma, including DEI. So, as as much as we want to adopt AI in government, this is why I asked, just want to force those questions of like, on what terms, and in terms of from a safety angle. So I know we're all here because not just policy, but this is a safety group. And thinking about those risks, there's a really heavy focus throughout this document about the role of the Department of Defense, which, I mean, on the face of it, totally makes sense. Yeah, it's that kind of strategic risk. It's definitely used in warfare. But one thing that maybe just is cause for pause is that they need to develop a list of priority workflows that they can automate and permanently transition them as soon as possible to being automated. Now, knowing even just a little bit about autonomous weapons and their kind of just general proliferation, that seems concerning. Seems like something that could be the spark to some kind of at least minor catastrophic event. So again, a risk to be wary of. Protecting innovation, kind of just standard IP stuff there. And then the last one, this is what I said with 30 for a loop. Oh, he said it did cut off. So it says combating synthetic media in the legal system, which this is what I said. When I was reading through these objectives, kind of like flowed pretty logical. And then this one just came out of left field and has a really heavy focus on what the rules for evidence are and what could be considered a deep fake or not. Which, again, on the face of it, seems pretty normal, but this is also coming from an administration that has certainly used disinformation in the past to sway public opinion and is engaged in countless lawsuits at all levels of the judiciary. So found that to be convenient and that was the priority in the like AI action plan for the entire country. So I'll pause there. Next is kind of like how do they build the infrastructure to actually support that and everything that they're trying to do. But let me just pause there and see if there's any questions, any comments. Yes. Sir. No, no. And that's one thing with this document. It is grandiose in its vision. It's very light on details. And that, I mean, fair enough, right? You can, not everything can be in one document, but no, it's not very clear on that. Yes. Does document mention anything about like legal professional, like let's say military um, domain, we would be the conflict in those things south. Right. And sorry, I realized I should be repeating the questions for the online audience. And just to repeat, the question there was, with respect to use of AI in military applications, any kind of application, who would be liable? And no, it doesn't get that specific, but also I wouldn't expect it to. I would expect, kind of the law of the land to prevail in that way. It's not legislation in that kind of way. And so to the extent that it's kind of like a plan from the executive branch, it really didn't have that clarity. We have lawyers in the room, so I'll defer. There's different answers. Yes, sir. Have you ever heard of the perimeter system, like utility in place now in the right so the perimeter system, and it's also called Dead Hand. By NATO. Right. Okay. You've already done these. In 1991, John for everybody about false flag was set it off. Like a start with you. So we're in that building together. True. And I'm just saying they didn't mention it, but they knew it too. It's only gonna be a matter of time. Yeah, and I mean, I think it would be wishful thinking to think that they haven't already, and especially post kind of collapse of the Soviet Union. And I know you said it's part of the Russian Federation too, but chances are that's already the case there. This is just kind of exacerbating that issue, and honestly, not even talking about kind of the catastrophic risk about nuclear. This is more just thinking about the automated workflows and things like, let's say, drones or autonomous weapons. Like that's kind of more the lens I was taking here. But I mean, absolutely, nuclear plays a role. Yes, Jake.
I'd say on safety, the focus on safety is actually very surprising. Because in the Paris conference, when Vance was there,
right,
he basically said, like, I'm not here to talk about AIC, I'm here to talk about AI opportunity.
Yes, yes.
And that was when they renamed the Safety Institute to the Security Institute.
Yes.
So everyone thought the Americans were out of safety at all. So this actually putting safety up front and actually directing government agencies to develop a framework for it.
Right.
Like before, safety was mostly done by people here or think tanks or maybe the UKAC. But like this actually leads government departments to actually directly do it now. So it's actually a huge bump up for safety.
I hope that is the case.
That's what I say.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a fair perspective. I think the other perspective that I would offer is just, and it comes through, I think, and I mean, you read this, right? So you might know better than me, but as I read through the documents, at the same time, there's this ostensible focus on safety. There's this constant push for deregulation and only describing it as a hindrance and as a problem. So, I mean, and again, I mean, you could speak out of both sides of your mouth, right? Say that, oh, we're all about safety, but also no regulation, right? I don't know how you reconcile those two things. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think a very clear example, if you maybe go back to the evaluation one.
Yes, evaluation ecosystem.
Yeah, so it's the language there is guidelines, support development, convene meetings, like none of that is in any way binding, right? So it doesn't say and then what do you do with the evaluation? There's no red line at this point, we can't develop or deploy, things like that, right? So it's like a light touch thing.
Exactly that. And almost it's like, that meme with the guy with all the show, he has all the lines going everywhere and it's like, it all connects, right? And it kind of does because, I mean, this is where the devil's in the details. These things sound, generally speaking, reasonable. But then to that very point Catherine made, you look at who's convening this working group, NIST, right after they stripped them of being able to include like DEI and climate in their frameworks. So again, how meaningful is that discussion really going to be about safety when you are essentially neutering the powers of some of these agencies. And it's also important to keep in mind that many of the agencies that are mentioned there have experienced some form of capture or perhaps change. So, an approach, sorry. But thank you. Those are all great points and questions. And yeah, now on to the physical kind of infrastructure that's there to support it, somewhere where Canada certainly could, um, we need to pull up our socks just a little bit, being the last in the G7 with our compute. But the Americans clearly get it. They should. They built it. And so they call it a really interesting stat, honestly, I didn't even recognize, which is American power capacity, energy capacity, sorry, in the grid has stagnated since the 70s. China has far surpassed the ability to put new energy capacity on the grid. And the perspective that also kind of, really made me think twice again is that it's kind of true. I mean, it's one of the first, I think it is the first digital service in modern life that challenges us to build new energy capacity. So it is a very real, kind of tangible problem in that way. And they approach it as such. So they have, and this is where what seems reasonable. It really requires some sober second thought here. So create streamlined permitting for creating, semiconductor manufacturing, building data centers, all really like good stuff that we need to do ASAP. But also establish new exclusions under environmental policy and expedite environmental permitting by streamlining or reducing regulation. This is coming from an administration that has already very much murdered the EPA's powers, canceled billions of dollars in funding, exited agreements. So doesn't exactly bode well, especially when they're making federal lands available for data center construction. Now I know that that's a balanced policy conversation, I think, where there probably is a happy medium somewhere. But again, you just wonder like what end of that spectrum is this going to end up on? I think we probably have some hints from past actions. Develop a grid to match the pace of AI innovation. So again, very kind of like common sense approach. Stabilize the grid today, build new capacity, don't take off capacity if it doesn't need to. If you can refurbish, please do. And I guess that was my oversight. I didn't put the last one there, but really just create a strategic blueprint for creating new energy capacity on the grid. So again, nothing too controversial there, but again, jump in, ask questions, raise concerns if you have them. And restore American semiconductor manufacturing. Again, something that's kind of very familiar topic where they've effectively outsourced all of their strategic capabilities to create the very technology that they're seeking to dominate in. And so it would make sense that if you want to dominate in something, you should probably be able to, if not build it in your own backyard, not be beholden to what you call your greatest rival or adversary for that supply. Messing up with the critic.
One quick comment.
Yeah.
I haven't read the reporting on it in detail, but 2 days after this, the Chinese AI action plan came out. And just in the context of this race, I thought it was quite interesting to see how they were putting forward green energy.
Yes. And I think even governance too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're big on governance.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
I mean, again, just an action plan.
Right, action plan.
So happen, but I thought it was still an interesting contrast.
Especially when they're putting so much coal power in, like, I don't know. But, at least the intent is there. No, but great point. Thank you for that. That is true. They did release it right after. And I mean, rightfully so. US called it right out that this is a race against China too. Build high security data centers for military, kind of straightforward stuff there. Train a skilled workforce to build the infrastructure. Actually, a really, really, really good point that they make here. We focus a lot on kind of the advanced manufacturing and high skilled labor. And not to say that this will not be high skilled labor in its own way, but the same way that Canada is kind of struggling today with a lack of skilled and registered tradespeople. It's no different. You will need tradespeople to build this infrastructure, from the electricians to the HVAC professionals. We maybe don't always think about that, right? It's easy to kind of overlook those things because you take for granted, like, yeah, lights turn on, there's AC, good. But when we're talking this level of industrial development, you need those things at scale. And I think I've heard projections of, 25 to 30,000 workers needed in the next, whatever, like 5 to 10 years. I'm sure there's all kinds of different projections like that, but we know it's a lot. And so they need to train them. And which may prove as a boon for some of the Rust Belt. And we've kind of seen some of those announcements in the past too, where, in a lot of hard hit communities, this is again why I say that just objectively, I think it's really, at least it's the right intent that they have around trying to understand the impacts of the labor market and how that will change and how they can mitigate some of those impacts. Because, in the Rust Belt, they've kind of made an effort, at least from what I've seen, to try and locate some of that manufacturing there to revitalize some of those communities where and when they can. And so, I think just overall, that can be something that returns dividends in terms of its benefits to society and to the broader, American economy. Um, Bolstering critical infrastructure, cybersecurity, again, just kind of like straightforward stuff. Yes, we should do that. But one thing they do call out there is establishing an information sharing center, which is not like exactly a groundbreaking idea, but I mean, I think just good intent on their part. Um, Promoting secure by design, again, pretty straightforward stuff. And this one again, like really, really something that I think other jurisdictions can take a lesson from, which is promoting the federal and I would just say state capacity really to respond to AI incidents, which they will need. I mean, can barely get our head around the thing and regulate it properly. So certainly, at the very least, need the ability to mitigate the real impacts and risks that we have today. We've already seen examples of where AI has gotten away from us. Thankfully, not in a way that's caused, at least as far as I know, crazy loss of life or anything like that. But not a reason not to be prepared. Sorry. Okay. All right. Sorry about that. I'll take a pause there. So that's the end of kind of the infrastructure side of things. Any questions, comments? My own personal opinion, I thought this was pretty straightforward. Like they're thinking about things the right way. There's just a big red flag there is about the lack of environmental protections in a world where they're already falling apart. All right. And this is where I start to have, so Jason, to your comment earlier, this is kind of where I start to get worried about the supposed focus on safety, because there's their last pillar, which again is like makes sense. There's clearly a need for more international, not that there isn't, for more international leadership when it comes to security and just general diplomacy and international relations around AI and how we develop, deploy it, govern it, and regulate it. But there's this focus on, okay, the US must also drive adoption of American AI systems, computing hardware, and standards throughout the world. Not terrible. That makes sense. But then, that last sentence makes me ask a question or two, which is, they want to leverage this advantage into an enduring global alliance while preventing adversaries from free riding on innovation and investment. Now, I say this because we stand or sit here in Canada, where we thought we were once, I guess, better allies. So who's in that alliance is one. Two, we've been accused of free riding. So who's free riding? So, those are some of the questions that kind of jumped out at me right away. In a world where, again, it's not very clear who exactly the allies are and who's free riding and who's not. But nonetheless, so right off the bat, export American AI to allies, partners. Makes sense. You want to increase your geopolitical influence, cultural, societal, everything else, your soft power. Basically, it's a great way of doing that. So it totally makes sense. At least they're upfront about it, right? And sorry, Wim, you have a question?
Yeah, I'd be curious to know your view on this. Yeah, I wonder if you think there's a tension between, on the one hand, promoting the goal of leading on adoption internationally of American AI, and also trying to kind of beat China on it. Like you saying, we don't want them to kind of free ride off our investment, but also we want them to adopt our. We want people to adopt our investment and lead on this. How do you kind of square those two?
I don't know that I can.
Did you repeat the question?
Oh yeah, sorry. Wim, just to remind me. So how do they reconcile? Basically, with the question of the online audience is, how do we reconcile that they don't really want? That they want everyone to adopt American AI, but at the same time, they don't want their adversaries like trying to free ride off of their development. Is that?
And they want to beat them. That's the whole.
And they want to beat them.
The general impetus for this,
right?
Largely, like,
yeah, and it honestly, like, I don't know how you really square those two things. I don't know that you necessarily can. I think that's kind of the ongoing, cat and mouse game of, of international relations, right? And like, how do you square those two things? I don't know if like I was talking with the USSR before. How do they square a number of kind of different approaches? Like you want them to change, but at the same time you don't want to share anything with them. And so I don't know how that works yet. Truthfully, I don't have a good answer for that. But I don't know that they do either, because there's some things they say in here that I think if you press just a little bit, they might crumble a little bit to dust because there's not a lot behind it. But as I said, they're right out front there about countering Chinese influence in international government bodies. I think it's anyways, I know at this point you probably know my political leanings, but I promise you I'm not that political. Um, but it's interesting that they wanted to kind of get them out of a place of influence so that American values can be promoted and to counter authoritarian influence. I don't know, if you're paying attention to what's happening south of the border. That's seems that's an interesting take. Um, I mean, strengthen export controls totally makes sense just from a strategic standpoint. I mean, you don't want your adversaries getting a hold of your most cutting edge technology. And so, I mean, pretty straightforward solution. Use location verification technology, see where it's going, enhance your ability to monitor kind of end use of these components. Plugging loopholes and kind of along the same theme, just plugging the loopholes on export controls today. And aligning, so this is the one where I wonder about safety, where they say, align protection measures globally. Um, and when they say doing that, that second bullet there, if you look towards the end, so it says develop, a diplomacy plan for an AI global alliance. Again, who are their allies? But more importantly, to induce key allies to adopt complementary AI protection systems and export controls. I mean, export controls not so worried about, but AI protection system. Like, there's this huge focus on deregulation, less focus on control, and then at the same time, basically saying that our allies have to align with this approach. And like they've actively called out the EU for being too onerous and there's too much regulation there. So again, what does that really mean? And are you going to force allies to choose, right? Um, cool. And yeah, and I mean, down to the level of like, hey, coordinate with allies to make sure they adopt U.S. export controls. Can have that question of like, who are U.S. allies? But still again pushing that kind of hegemonic approach of like, hey, like what we say kind of goes. It's true to our world order or the other world order. Um, ensure but this, I mean, again, this is where they throw you one where it's just like objectively a good thing. Ensure that they're at the forefront of evaluating national security risks for frontier models. That is just generally speaking, I think a pretty positive thing. Jason, keep me honest, I know that's your expertise, but that is something that I think all regions probably could stand to benefit more from. And the very last, which is investing in biosecurity. Again, no surprise, one of the major kind of catastrophic risks associated with AI is the use by malicious actors. And so they kind of call it out, especially for biological threats. And so they call it out right off the bat. That's kind of their final piece, is to say, hey, we need to have better oversight of use of those tools in creating biological compounds. And I apologize for using the wrong words, but I think you can see where this is going. You want to stop the development of bioweapons, and the way they'll do that is by screening for fraudulent and malicious actors, and being a lot tighter on kind of what and where they fund. So that brings us to the end of the kind of the meat and potatoes of the AI action plan. I just wanted to chat with you about a couple kind of key takeaways that at least I found, and then open it up for a Q&A. I have some slides that prompt some questions if you'd like that. There's a couple of themes there that I teased out. But I mean, so let me just kind of summarize here for you. So I mean, as I mentioned kind of at the outset, it's a seems like a pretty comprehensive plan at the first read of it. And despite some of kind of the political rhetoric, and I should say, like, in the actual plan itself, each one of those charts, right, of objectives and actions has like a whole preamble to it. That's where you'll read more of kind of like the political rhetoric that comes through. But ignoring that for a second, we kind of want to just control for that, because again, I don't know that that's specific to this particular plan. That's just a general thing. There is some helpful guidance that we really should think more about what this is going to do to our workforce. And if I Google Canada AI strategy, like all you're going to find is a CPAR strategy from like 2017, right? Or some like landing page with with hot links. And so, hey, as much as we can criticize what we can criticize, take it for what value it has, which is it definitely does point to some key critical areas. I mean, and our approach can be different, right? We want to prioritize building infrastructure, great, but we also value how we're going to integrate sustainable energy and renewable energy into that and sustainable building practices. Sorry, did you have a question? Oh, good. All right. And so kind of just woven that second point there, which is the approach to labor and the impacts to the workforce seem pretty reasonable, and it is pretty promising that they clearly understand the value of open source and open weights and open sharing. It is light on details though around kind of implementation, how this is going to be resourced, what are the timelines around this. I mean, you have to be reasonable with expectations about how much you can fit in a document like that, but I mean, it's quite extensive on what it proposes. So there probably could have made even a bit of better balance between those two things. But yeah, the one theme that really just stuck out to me throughout is where they just kept throwing it in there. I mean, it's the first thing. It's literally the first thing, right? Onerous regulation. It just keeps coming back, whether on an environmental lens or otherwise. Um, it's a clear change in tone from the last administration, whose executive order was literally called, right? Safe, trustworthy, and secure. I mean, they have secure here, so safe and trustworthy AI. And I think it was called, I think they termed it as like the dangerous approach that the Biden administration took towards AI. So, I mean, that is the stark kind of difference between the two. And comes through in, again, like the rest of the environment. Throughout this document, where the environment is concerned, there is little to no, almost like being inconsiderate. It's not consideration, it's consideration of how can we just kind of, circumvent whatever protections are there or just remove them altogether so we can do what we need to do. And yeah, this kind of like hegemonic approach to regulation where, okay, they have this tone of deregulation, that regulation is not a good thing. And, I take regulation as kind of, being synonymous to some extent with safety and control. And I don't mean that in like the technical academic sense. I just mean generally speaking, getting control of this issue. Um, but then at the same time, have this tone of like, well, and our allies have to align with us. So is that to say that if we take a different approach to regulation or control, that we're no longer an ally? So it's just strange that those two things would be tied together, especially when the U.S. itself clearly has been not too sure what direction they're going on. Yep.
And I think for me, the most important takeaway of section 3 on international diplomacy
Yeah.
is like stuff like this, like about allies, like seeking to dominate the global
International
market,
discourse.
like the AI
Right.
infrastructure, needing allies to come as a line. Like this begins basically the global race between China and US to carve up the globe in terms of who wins the tech ecosystem of the world, which has been happening for the last couple of decades, but like kind of more chill. This is going to be much more of this is going to be people are going to be much more countries are going to be forced to choose
Exactly.
in ways that are much more direct and like we're gonna like in the Soviet Union days we used to have the Iron Curtain.
Right.
This one will be called like the Silicon Curtain.
Right. And that's a great example. And for the online audience, very smart gentleman here just pointed out the fact that, hey, like, this is kind of pointing towards a world where countries will be forced to choose between the US tech stack or the Chinese tech stack. But I mean, going beyond just the tech stack, it's like choosing an ideology. And if we think about the USSR as kind of, let's think back to the Cold War days, I don't know that countries that didn't subscribe to the US ideology fared very well in the eyes of the US. I say that as being a product to some extent of those countries, right? Where if you did not subscribe to the US kind of rhetoric around how the world should work and how you should operate your country and with what interests in mind, they would fix that for you, for lack of a better term.
I started to say though, I noticed that there are countries that are influences towards hit that middle ground. The one of the most common is Singapore. Singapore is like I think 2 major data centers from the United States, like Microsoft one of the company, and they have 2 as well built from China. And they're interesting sourcing like a lot of AI investments from both countries to try to just like a nexus.
Right. Right, and so just for the online audience, we had someone raise a very good point that some countries do that today, Singapore being one of them. I will also just say that Singapore is very unique in that regard, in that they have a long history of being able to thread that needle very skillfully about how to manage their relationship with China and the U.S. Across many different administrations. Yes.
Even the recent dichotomy when it comes to AI regulation with EU enacting the AI Act, despite some pushback from countries like France and US going towards full deregulation. What do you think Canada is going to do?
Yeah. So the question for the audience is, in light of the EU AI Act being passed, and even member state like France pulling out, and versus the kind of focus on deregulation from the US, like where will Canada sit, right, within those two kind of polar opposites? I if I think about from the geopolitical lens, and we have a geopolitical expert in the room, so he'll keep me honest, which is, Canada, and if nothing else, just by necessity, is more closely allied with the EU these days, and that's by necessity we are with the US too. And we expect that, hopefully, that relationship to change. But all that to say is, like, in terms of values, though, I think we're probably a lot closer values aligned with kind of the EU style of approach. Even down to the simple fact that our AI Safety Institute collaborates, quite a bit with the UKIS, and it looks to them as like a gold standard as well. So I think that's pretty indicative of like our view um, on AI regulation. So if I'm using that as kind of like an indicator, I would think it would probably lean closer towards the EU approach. But again, I mean, some extreme policy action by the US that may be punitive to Canada could change that, right? Hopefully not, but that's the risk. Yes.
I want to blur the lines a little bit as well. So we have under the EUAI Act this code of practice that is sort of like a tool to help the general purpose AI model developers to comply with the EUAI Act. And currently it's a voluntary instrument that the big developers need to sign essentially to indicate their intention to use it in order to determine their internal compliance measures. And so we are currently in the space we're trying to figure out who's going to sign and who isn't. And we have some of the big AI developers, most notably OpenAI, actually signing it. So we have that sort of from the spillover from the EU into the US. That could mean that, yeah, okay, US has this plan, but the EU has a very different approach. And if the big players sign on to, from the industry, sign on to what the EU is doing, then we can get to a standard that is far beyond what the AI action plan might indicate.
Right. That is an excellent point. Now, what I will say to the online audience is that is your incentive to show up, is to hear other smart people say smart things. I cannot, I will not repeat that. But no, that is a very good point. I will just go to then did I get the last one? Yeah, I mean, we talked about that. We'll get more into it, which is this weird focus on woke AI. You don't see it actually come out in the objectives, but in the complementary executive orders, sorry, there's this just strange focus on woke AI and what that even means, a whole other story. But that systems must be objective and free from bias. Don't know who decides that, how you measure that, and if that's even possible. I mean, like I said, sure, you can measure in some ways, but like bias free, according to whom? And what exactly is bias free? So, anyway, onto the Q&A. So I guess like kind of a little bit different style. I just thought, I tease out some themes rather, and you could just chat through them, have some question marks here. So there's a clear intention of this being a race. You kind of just hear that in the general rhetoric around it. That's like a strategic arms race, just like nuclear power, and the U.S. racing against Nazi Germany to develop the first nuclear weapon. But with all this rhetoric, is that pouring fuel on the fire of an existing tension and creating a Thucydides trap? Now, I'm a philosopher. That just came up in some of my research. I've heard that term before. Basically, just meaning that when you have one declining power, which we kind of do, and one that's potentially on the rise, that can have a tendency towards war. That's my understanding. Someone smarter than me, correct me, please. But all that to say is, like, is this pouring fuel on an existing geopolitical tension that could then lead to, boots on the ground kind of conflict? And throughout the document, again, you'll see more of that if you actually go through and read it. I mean, it's riddled with acronyms. There's so many agencies mentioned everywhere, but the Department of Defense is a very strong theme throughout. And especially that piece about automating workflows as soon as possible. Is that cause for concern? And does that raise the risk of catastrophic events like a flash war as automated warfare becomes more prevalent? So these are some of the questions that I was left with as I left, coming into the document, and would love to hear, some of your thoughts and concerns or perspectives. Yes.
Liquidity's trap. I actually read documents about that. And I think it's actually very critical to the problem because the US and China are going to do everything they can to win. They're in an equal war. And that's we can start predicting what's going to happen. They're going to do everything to speed up AI research and do everything they can to not slow it down so you can kind of predict from there. Because the winner, they believe, will be able to become the new hegemonic power. displace the U.S. or U.S. insurance. So with those kinds of states that they're just starting to escalate rapidly. China's now using those rare earths to record. This will escalate. We do not allow one or the other to win. And the trajectory of that was a direct military. And I don't see how they're going to get out of that yet.
Well, for all of our sake, I hope you're wrong. But
Can you do
I
a
know
plug
that
for
you're right.
next week?
Do a plug for next week. Okay, sure.
Jason's talk on next week.
Like the second question about involvement in adoption, like Department of Defense causing concern. I'll be doing this talk next week about
All right.
U.S. frontier AI deployments and U.S. national security apparatus.
There we go. So next week we will have a talk on the applications of AI in defense. And say that one more time. So it's the applications of frontier AI systems
frontier
in,
AI in like US national defense.
in U.S. national defense and security. Right?
Tomorrow.
It'll be announced tomorrow again. So anyways, come stay tuned for that because we have a resident geopolitical expert who can talk to us about that. Yes, question.
So, here it's going to be a little bit nitpicky about terminology.
Knock yourself
So,
out.
in World War II, the winning the race was getting the nuclear bomb.
Mhm.
In Cold War, the winning the race was like multiple kind of iterations. So let's say Sputnik or Sputnik, whatever you call
Yeah,
it,
that's
that
space
was the
race,
first
right? Yeah.
iteration on space. And then later it was the economic meltdown, also the human basically, that caused, this disintegration. I was in some form, of course. That's not the reason. But then when it comes to this race, winning the race is what establishing technological hegemony over like the world, or how would it be defined?
So the question is, how would winning the race be defined? And I mean, in all fairness, that's the first part of the title is winning the race. And I have to say, I unfortunately have to kind of almost answer your question with a question. Is that's the same question I'm left with? What is the race, and what does winning it mean? And is this a race to our own demise? And thankfully, I'm in a group where like we do talk about those things. But that's exactly the question I'm left with. I don't know that there's a clear answer to it. Just in those cases, there wasn't really either. At one point, they thought it was, oh, we'll build the most amount of nuclear weapons we possibly can. Right. And then there's like, okay, then there's the denouement. We're not going to build anymore. We're going to have treaties, and good. Then the next kind of thing that we're going to base on, right? So I'm honestly not too sure. But do you have perspective on it there? I don't want to put you on the spot. Like, if you did,
I think it's just there should be a clear adoption of specific technology that clear cut is better than the other one.
Yes.
That and
True.
how's that defined?
Should you're an idealist, my friend? I like that. Yes.
So, I guess one part of it was that they're in a race to build this weapon.
Mhm.
In the hopes of reaching something similar to what the nuclear is done.
Right.
Like that was the end.
Mutually assured
Cold
destruction.
War. Yeah. And so I guess optimistically that's like one way we see where it's not a race to destroy the other, or a race to build the technology to destroy that, but the race to build the technology to defend yourself against the other, like preemptively. If they get to India, you got that out of the house.
Yes, and honestly, in my limited understanding of this world, that's kind of what I hope for too. But it is different, right? Like to build that is to build something that is almost by definition beyond your own capabilities and control. So we don't even know what that will. At least they have the formulas to understand like what a nuclear weapon is. They know how it works. They know when it goes off and what has to happen before it goes off, right? And exactly what it will do, almost to morbid precision. I don't know that we can do that. So as much as I hope for that, I don't know.
But it's not efforts towards the state of equilibrium is the race to world dominance, right?
It's not that. Sorry.
I said it's not an effort towards a stable.
No,
equilibrium,
exactly.
it's
No,
the
and that's
race
exactly it.
to
That's why, like,
world
I'm not exactly hopeful because, like, the first thing it says, we're out for dominance. Like, I don't want to see what
But the stable equilibrium is like a result again. Like no one has to want it. It's the thing that just
Right,
happens.
right. And so it's a very real possibility.
But not a VGI, like the AS
Not
syndrome.
not in the ASI.
AJAS, but there was actually like a report about this called mutually assured AI malfunction, which is almost like a equilibrium where the U.S. and China both poison each other's AIs, and then they go misaligned and they wreak havoc on the world. And then so they were drawing a parallel between what you're saying about like the nuclear arms, like mutual assured destruction.
I thought I was gonna sleep tonight. Jeez. Yes. Question.
Maybe to shift a little bit away from the war front. Can you
Sure.
go back to the pillar three, the slide?
Yeah, sure. First one or second?
Okay, so here, it's okay here. So there's a quote is the United States must drive adoption of American AI systems, computing hardware standards throughout the world. I I think if we look at in the past 8 years, there's 8 years ago there were a bunch of different AI frameworks like Trainer, CMTK, Cafe 2, and a bunch of different AI hardware companies. Today's more or less without US driving adoption, it's more or less converged to the PyTorch through the NVIDIA system. My question is, so first of all, that in and of itself feels like a huge risk for AI safety. My question is, do you know of policies or that's driving the creation of alternative stack away from the PyTorch, NVIDIA, or of groups that are working to create?
I will be honest and say I am not. I know enough to know kind of what you're asking, but I'm not technically involved enough to know that. But two is, if that was the case, I feel like at some point we were part of the conversation, not here, but just elsewhere. And honestly, I have not heard anything like that. I think that is kind of a major, that is the major concern globally, is that there isn't really a way to move away from that yet. But truthfully, I honestly don't know. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, just like the answer.
Mhm.
Even the many players are adopting methods to which convert like whatever specific to them, which is AMD,
Right.
to the NVIDIA stuff, like the PyTorch.
Mhm.
Yeah, there isn't much of a method.
There isn't much of an okay, so
I think aren't they? But isn't what they're referring to? Like if through Digital Silk Road, if China offers DeepSeek with like cloud computing infrastructure as like a package, and they could like countries can like have partnerships and like deploy it with an ecosystem. Like, isn't that allowed? So like,
No, no. It means they're like lower level. Rather, because DeepSeek is again with its something, and that something is universal. Like there isn't any competitor to that, like lower level stuff.
is it not a low level Chinese stack?
No, as far as we know.
And just for the online audience, the question that we had earlier was, are there any efforts in the industry right now to move away from the current tech stack? And keep me honest here, I know you said PyTorch and NVIDIA, right?
Yeah.
Right. And if there's any kind of effort underway to move away from that, maybe to AMD, but then the answer is no, generally speaking, we're not hearing any ideas around. And that's what we were talking about earlier when we said, it probably would have come up at some point if that was the case, but it seems like nobody's really heard of that. Yes, man.
I seriously, I've always been doing a lot of research in there actually. Like, I used like articles in the United States like 2 days ago that spoke about the investment we've been making with the chips because they realized that the reliance on US chips is,
Right.
right now there's still so much level, we should say, different countries. But they realized that if they're going to be a meaningful big player in this space moving forward, they want to sell to them. And China seems to have the human capital with really smart engineers. And so I think that it's not too far off before we see a viable alternative. My only concern is that that's still not really like a very competitive space, right? That just means NVIDIA or Huawei, like that.
Right.
You got one more, right? One's better.
Yeah, true. And I mean, in all fairness, I think with a lot of advanced industries, at the very cutting edge, that sometimes is the case. And those players become more and more entrenched over time. And sorry, just for the online audience, we just had someone mention that Huawei apparently has been doing some interesting work in trying to reduce their dependency on the existing kind of tech stack and chip supply. And that's, I mean, I think it's to be expected as people understand that vulnerability and that concentration of risk. the market will naturally, ideally, look for alternatives and create them. I think we saw a hand go for it. Yeah. Question.
You guys keep talking about sources,
Sources.
supplies.
Sorry.
You guys keep talking about supplies, but I'm thinking, where's the demand
Where's the demand for?
AI in general? Because we are here, we think AI is being used in everything. The reality is, AI isn't. Like, if you go to some town in the middle of nowhere in the US, talk to the kids there, they're not even using AIs.
Right, but is that a representative sample of our
That
society?
that is what I'm seeing here, probably different people who are either in corporate, they're refusing to use AI because
Yeah.
they are afraid of AI taking over their job.
Yeah.
I'm in AI implementation as part of the security concern. And corporates is refusing to push for AI because they are afraid their data is being leaked out.
I hear what you're saying, but I gotta just kind of stop there and just say that, I strongly disagree in terms of source and to kind of use a pun on the word. Like, what are the sources for that? Because every major nation, including Canada, has set out to secure more compute because there's such a demand for this infrastructure and hardware. They literally can't get their hands on it. That's why we're talking about, are there other alternatives to that supply? And then the second part of it is, show me one publicly traded company or one major corporation that has not stated their usage or intended adoption of AI. I don't know that that's really the case. So that is not being used everywhere. I agree that there's not a demand for it though. I think is belied by the fact that they're building an AI action plan. Like, that's why it's such a topical issue, right? Sorry, we have a.
I'm still going to say though that the demand doesn't necessarily have to come from the actors we're thinking of, right?
Right.
Like here in Canada, I think it's really good that the government is pouring so much money into compute, precisely because like I want to do research on these machines, on these models, and it's quite hard if, for example, you're reliant on the United States for a lot of those resources, because I mean relationships diplomatically already breaking down. So it's a lot better if we can do in-house research, especially if we can do in-house research on in-house models, So I feel like the demand, like it can come from a lot of places, and maybe that you're sort of constraining your imagination to a smaller part of the space than it really is.
And just like to think from a broader societal lens, like forget even like I don't know, the right word, but structured actors, like the adoption curve for these technologies, just among the general public, among let's say the population that's in school right now, right? Like the amount of every student, like every educator is struggling with how their students are using generative AI. That creates a demand. Like there is physical compute that needs to be online to allow that to happen. And so even if it's not coming from the traditional actors that I kind of mentioned, it's all around us. And it's part of why we're here, and it's part of why, again, every kind of major developed country is trying to figure out like how do we secure our own sovereign AI, and that includes infrastructure. There's a lot of it. I'm gonna go with you.
Yeah. You mentioned that they're like pushing for like open source AI.
Mhm.
It's like a good thing.
I
I feel like I'm kind of confused on this
Sure.
because I feel like first of all, it's very unclear to me if open weight AI actually is better. I think there's like a lot of reasons why it's like worse potentially.
Mm.
And also like I think there seems to be a push like away from that, like with like Meta, sort of building their like new super intelligence lab and
Right.
Llama being like pretty bad. Yeah, I'm just like curious like why you think like open source is like part of this plan and like why that's usually focused.
No, and that's a totally fair question for the online audience. The question was, why the bent towards thinking that open source is a good thing, that they've included it in this plan. And this is where maybe it's helpful to read the plan, kind of language surrounding it, simply because around this particular point, they do talk about the fact that, especially to benefit academic institutions, smaller, independent researchers, that's really part of the focus. Is that a lot of these institutions require that or need that. And you correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I understood when I worked in the space, I mean that was a helpful thing for developers and researchers. So I think from that standpoint, it can. But are there angles of it that maybe are unhelpful? Absolutely. But that was kind of the lens that they were pointing at from.
Yeah, I think I'm just like open source AI just tends to be dangerous.
No disagreement there.
Yeah.
right? But again, balance, right? You got to find a balancing.
Also, China
yeah.
is doing it, right?
China
So
is
China's open sourcing
Right.
that. And so I
There's
think part of the
an
motivation
imperative.
is here that you want to grab that market share and make sure
Right.
the dominance.
Right, and that's an excellent point. Sorry, I should also add that. So aside from just the altruism behind it, which not altruism, right? But there is a very specific focus on soft power. So for our online audience, as someone just mentioned, that China is very big on open sourcing, and that's almost like outright what the U.S. calls out in this plan is that a part of our way to continue securing and broadening our soft power and geopolitical influence is to ensure that other jurisdictions are adopting our models. Open source helps with that.
Let's say that's the overt reason.
Overt, yeah.
That's the only reason that's in there. It's
Yeah.
for China because they're putting everything behind open source in order to detract from US, like make their tech sector take another $100 billion hits like they did in February. That's the whole way. That's the only reason that thing's in there.
We got one more there, and I'll just probably move on to another just themes, just so we can get towards like the broken out discussions. Yep, we have one question there.
I have something about OpenAI. They did safety testing. It was the only frontier system that actually refused threat orders to shut down on three different versions of different groups. No other system did. This is the first time it's being seen. This is being reported. I don't know if I'm seeing it. It's only OpenAI, which I found very interesting considering their mandate when we first put down, which looks like very awesome. Most promising.
That sounds concerning. I can't say I've read that, but I mean that does sound concerning. Has anyone else in the audience heard?
I was going to say last week on Thursday we had to talk about how they tested very many different models and the propensity to avoid shutdown wasn't only open.
Right. Oh, that is very true. Sorry, Giles talked. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So part of the comment was OpenAI recently was seen as one of the only systems that wouldn't shut down if it was required to. But very good point. Our last talk on AI Safety Thursdays was about the fact that hey, this is not the only system that actually does that. More and more advanced systems have more and more, I guess, worrisome behavior in terms of how they evade control or being shut down.
Right.
Or being shut down. Sorry.
Well,
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
have a really
please.
interesting piece in there. But,
Please.
the point the other speaker was making about how cities research finding that both three wishes to shut down. I think what made that interesting is that in the talk we saw last week, when the models were told, let yourself be shut down, the rate of compliance always increased. What made Palisades research so interesting on the OpenAI series of models is that when they told all three, allow yourself to be shut down, that made no meaningful difference to its rate of shutdown. So I think that's one important thing.
Well, this is another example of why you need to buy a ticket and show up. I'm gonna repeat that one. Smart people saying smart stuff. Buy a ticket and come and hear what they have to say. Just quickly, so there's just only 2 more slides here, and then honestly, it's just more for discussion to stimulate some discussion. The other kind of major theme that I saw coming through this, no surprise, I was mentioning it throughout, is the risk to the climate. I think there's a really high potential, to increase the risk to the environment, worsened by the fact that there's like climate denial just outright in the documents. And oh yeah, it's right in the introduction. Sorry, I just pulled up this quote here. We need to build and maintain and vast infrastructure, blah, blah, blah. We will continue to reject radical climate dogma and bureaucratic red tape. I mean, that's just like in the first page of the plan. So it doesn't exactly bode well for environmental protections, again, in an administration where much of this has been rolled back. And especially when it comes to building new data centers or manufacturing centers, there's a kind of really concerning focus on, using deregulation as a tool and expediting permits, circumventing existing protections. So yeah, just something that I like to call it for the group as well. Any thoughts, comments on climate? And I'm sorry, I didn't mention it here, but probably should have, which is when they talk about energy requirements, no discussion whatsoever about renewable or sustainable. So, that's a question. All right, last one. So ideological conformity. This is an interesting one. Maybe just me in my own head. But we kind of mentioned at the front, which is there's this very clear use of language, which I don't think is specific to this document. I think that's just a general tool. I mean, just generally political discourse. But there's clearly an attitude towards regulation of it being onerous, burdensome, something that hinders rather than protects and facilitates. I mean, good regulation should not stifle. In fact, it should create environments to encourage innovation. And yeah, I mean that kind of second point of which is really heavy emphasis throughout the document about American values and alignment with American values. And what are American values? Are Americans even clear on what American values are today versus values around the social good or what is good for humanity or what is good for society? Understanding the fact that, hey, if you're going to project AI beyond your borders, that your values may not necessarily align with your end user or customer. They don't have to be diametrically opposed, but yeah, I think just a really strange thing to really weave so deeply throughout the kind of conversation there. We mentioned earlier kind of just this, specific focus on the DOJ oversight of rules of evidence for deepfakes is just really felt like it really came out of left field. And that's why I said it's very convenient for an admin that's fighting countless, court cases, and has, used kind of disinformation writ large. In both the plan and the executive orders, there's this requirement of objectivity, being bias-free, and that frontier models, that frontier models need to be objective and bias-free, and it says that from the top down. Again, like, what does that even mean? For it to be objective and bias-free from the top down, especially when it's supposed to remove the dogma of DEI and radical ideas like climate change. I don't know, that sounds biased, in my view at least. And yeah, so just quickly, kind of where the rhetoric doesn't show up in the plan, but maybe in the supporting executive order. So this is what I was talking about earlier. One of the executive orders, there's 3 of them, is called Preventing Woke AI in the Federal Government. And I mean, don't mince words. One of the most pervasive and destructive of these ideologies is called diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, hey, I know there's a debate around it. I did not realize it was so destructive. And this is where I was mentioning earlier when it comes to procurement of AI in the US government, which I have to imagine is one of the largest buyers in the world. They must only procure systems that are ideologically neutral. And this is where, again, they don't really mince words in saying that, that where results are not manipulated, that is nonpartisan, that it's not in favor of ideological dogmas like DEI. So yeah, just this kind of strained focus on ideological conformity. So yeah, anyways, that kind of brings it to an end. Just wanted to raise those themes as food for thought for your breakout discussions, or we can keep asking questions here. I do see some hands, so lots. Catherine?
Yeah, one comment to Kelly's front. It sounds like straight out of the Chinese rule book. Basically, they started this like ideologically aligned with Chinese values sort of stuff. One thing that if I try to be positive is I can say it excites me if we're between a rock and a hard place in US and China, that perhaps this is the motivation middle powers need to come together, form some sort of consortia of sorts, and provide a middle path that is
I agree. And we're one of
based on
those.
values and stuff.
I agree. So the comment here is, one hopeful thing on the horizon is perhaps, having and sorry, I should say up front that this approach to things and ideological alignment, someone in the audience was just mentioning that this is very, reminiscent of kind of the Chinese approach as well. And that at least in that kind of dichotomy, maybe there is space for middle powers like a Canada or maybe like a UK to come in and help set a better direction, chart a better course. Because that's kind of what happens when you have 2 big powers that are saber-rattling against each other. They're not going to back down. They're beating their chests. It's not going to happen. You need other actors to come in the middle there that can broker those discussions and broker a better future. I saw a lot of hands, so maybe that answer all questions. Like 5. Okay, move on. Yeah,
Let me finish my
please do.
My point is, he was asking.
But just for the record, like we're not arguing. It was a question. If you have a question.
The country or the side that's in unity is the one that adopted the most, but not just in some people. It's going to be in everyone. Because the AI is not adopted in everyone, in every age group, or in every job. That will be only used by the elites. And that will never drive enough adoption for that side to win, because there's nothing going to be capitalizing the pay for that infrastructure anyway. And that's the same thing with China, because you got to have someone to use it. To have all those investment that makes sense, whether it's driving the model or whether it's doing all those infrastructure, people have to use it at every age and every job function in order for that race to be done.
spoken like someone who truly works in adoption.
The military, right?
Unless you,
Unless you consider just the military adoption to be sufficient to win on some level.
right.
There's something else.
Right.
The amount of money that's being put in, these hundreds of billions of dollars. They're doing it for some reason, so they must see something. But they
Yeah.
didn't do it out of it. It's like a hundred.
Thank you. And so there's a question
Yes,
there.
since, we were talking about winning the race.
Sure.
Quote unquote.
Mhm.
I think, at least, with, and who wins it? It's basically if the AI's ability to either increase the productivity of the workforce in a way that will replace, or say, I'm not gonna say replace humans, but more so to compensate for the declining fertility rates. The demographic collapse, basically, the demand is can be in some form compensated by the increase of productivity through AI. I think probably that's what we consider that.
Yeah, and I think it includes a whole spectrum of things. Because as Catherine just kind of mentioned, it can only be in the military front, right? I mean, that may be enough. Who knows, right? So, but I mean, good perspective. Thank you. And yeah.
Yeah, question.
Oh yeah, please, Mario.
Well, you had your hand up first.
He's gonna give a stab at why, how it would work, what the race is about. It's a geopolitical race, so it's military, but it's also, it's full spectrum. The idea is that first when you get AGI,
Mm.
establishes leadership, they use that leverage to start cycling autonomous, reversal of improvement. They get faster and faster. They then establish ASI that establishes AI supremacy, or lead so far ahead, no one can challenge it. They then use the ASI, assuming they maintain control, good question, is that now is cycling, and it uses that to get what's called full spectrum dominance. That establishes world hegemony. So the whole who rules the world is what's at stake. And that alone is enough to drive all the rest.
Tale as old as time. Who rules the world? Good point. Thank you. Mario, question?
Yeah, so it's like an overall question about the report.
Yeah.
There's, I did not read it. My main source when I found out about it was Steve Auschwitz, who was usually quite critical of the stuff. He was more cosmos than I expected. And his main explanation was that, like, he found that the rhetoric was pretty bad in that, like, there was a lot of kind of the general rhetoric that you expect from the administration,
Right.
but that there was like quite a disconnect between the overall rhetoric and then what you got down to the proposals themselves. Like, would you generally agree that that's like a broadly accurate characterization of this, or do you think that the rhetoric is maybe still pretty problematic and will kind of seep heavily into how it's enforced?
Yeah, and that's a great point. And by the way, thank you for letting me know that perspective. I did give that article a read and I kind of got that sense as well. And just for the online audience, there's a question from the audience about a recent blog post about the action plan came from an author who typically would be quite critical of something like this, but actually was seemingly hopeful and thought that, despite the rhetoric, there's some useful stuff in there. And so that is kind of what I saw as well. Who knows, maybe that also influenced my opinion. But I mean, generally speaking, that is kind of what I saw. And that's why I just called out here, despite the political rhetoric, probably does serve as helpful guidance. And there is, however, to your point, like the devil's in the details, right? Like some of those things that sound really sensible, like, hey, we're going to bring together industry consortia. Who's going to lead it? NIST. NIST, who's now been neutered of some of their powers, who is run by the Department of Commerce, that has, a particular kind of leader in it, and is no longer allowed to subscribe to the dogmas of DEI and climate change. So, on the face of it, yeah, bring together industry consortia, share ideas, collaborate on safety, great idea. Who's going to lead it? And with, under kind of what guise? So that's kind of where the devil's in some of the details. But there are some things, there's a lot of it in there. And that's why I said, like, the focus on the labor market, the focus on building the supply chain, the focus on securing vulnerabilities, those types of things. I mean, just objectively things that need to happen, right? So, yeah, see a question, yeah?
So my question is, I've been around for a couple of AI instances in there's some concern about people in our country, Canada, the AI business doesn't make too many products better than like we are like they're focusing on making some algorithms like that.
Whereas the US, I think there's quite a big number of companies already using their product and make profitable. So do you think we should more go to US style that's more like go to the business mentality? Because I think the my point is like the like a, if you're an investor, you want to invest some money, and then your startup is not going to produce the product that is going to make generate the revenue or the profit. So what's the point, right? So I think US is really going that direction. So I think that may be some sort of a topic of discussion.
For sure. If I'm just thinking about my understanding of it, I mean, I think that's long been the case. That's in fact a major issue that so much of our IP goes to the US to get commercialized. As soon as startups that showed a little bit of promise, they get bought up. That's for a number of reasons, including our tax policy, investment policy. Those are things that definitely need to change as well. Um, will we go towards a more US style? I mean, that's more of a political theory kind of question, I guess. But I think the short answer is, and my political expert there shake her head, which I agree with, which is no. And the reason no is like fundamentally we're different countries. We have different risk tolerances. It's characterized in our behavior. It's characterized in our language, even in our industry. That's not a bad thing. When the global financial system almost crashed, Canadian banks stood tall and were very safe. Simply because they didn't have the same kind of risk tolerance, while U.S. banks failed left, right, and center. And it was tanked the entire global economy. So it doesn't necessarily make it better though, right? For business, to your point, like that's just something we really struggle with across so many industries. Once we have a promising company, US investors will absolutely come and snap it up right away. Even if not all the staff, they'll just buy the IP and go commercialize it somewhere else. And part of the reason that's not necessarily even our risk tolerance. We're not a big enough market to offer necessarily the scale always for adoption to make commercialization viable. So I don't think we'll go to a US style. However, there's certain lessons we can take away from that honestly are even agnostic of AI. It's just more about our policy when it comes to encouraging innovation and commercialization, just basically like industrial policy and economic development. Yeah, I'll probably make this the last one and then I'll break off into the smaller discussions. That's cool.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'll just come to a closing. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we got one more.
Yeah, back to the part about infrastructure. I think I had some points from before.
Mhm.
Oh, okay, yeah, maybe it was somewhere else, but yeah, like they have this point where they're like, oh, we want to like do export controls for like subsystems of developing
Yeah, I saw that.
chips.
Yeah.
Like I'm kind of confused with that. Like what even are those subsystems? Because my understanding is that it's like the only thing that really matters is like TSMC and their like chip fabs.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I know exactly what you're talking about now. I just want to see if I can find it back. I ended up taking out the subsystem piece because like it got a little too specific. But just give me 1 second. Restore manufacturing. Uh, anyways, I get what you're saying. So the question, generally speaking, was about, there's this focus. There was also a focus in this plan about building capabilities to build the, what was it again? The subsystems, right? Right, for chip fab, exactly, for chip manufacturing. And I think the rationale for that is like, okay, like manufacturing the actual chip is one thing, but there's a whole supply chain that comes before that. They also need to be able to send, or else they're still kind of at the behest of other jurisdictions that can produce that. So, okay, great, you can assemble the car in the US, but if you're depending on all these other jurisdictions to give you the component pieces, like you're not necessarily in a better place. I think it's kind of that idea. That makes sense.
Some insights into
Yes.
subsystems.
Please, in the chips industry itself.
Yeah, so TSMC is it's what's in the news, but it's a big part of manufacturing. But the front end design is much more complicated. There's 3 companies, Cadence, Synopsys, and Siemens that owns what's called the EDA tools. That you need to be able to design the chips before shipping them off to TSMC. So we're talking about things like memory controllers, for example. If you want to run these really large language models, from whatever company, you need a type of memory system called HBM3, and how HBM interfaces with other things on the chip. So that will be lots of that uses Synopsys and Cadence IP. In fact, the Cadence office in Canada is like right across the street from here.
I think on that, and I think on that note, we'll bring this formal Q&A to a close. Going to talk to a close. Maybe we'll call Mario up to do the closing. And more importantly, I just want to thank you all for your patience, your time, your listening ear, your curiosity. I hope you got something of value out of this. I know I'm smarter for having just listened to your questions. And I mean, I'll be around. And over to you, Mario.
Cool.
Thank you so much, Ajay. I was about to start with a big round of applause, but you guys covered that already. Yeah, again, thanks so much for coming, everybody, and thank you to our online viewers for joining us there. If it's your first time at this event, we do events here every Thursday. We do a more technical event, and most Tuesdays, it's probably going to become every Tuesday at the rate things are going. We'll do an AI policy event. So if you haven't already, please subscribe on Luma to the Trajectory Labs calendar. And yeah, that's it. You're welcome to hang around for the next hour or so until the last one of us with keys kicks you out. Thanks for coming.
Retail, right?